Hello! Welcome to Zilog and Moto. I'm your host Dave, and this is the channel where each and every week I pick a game from the library of the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, or 32X, and do a deep dive review of the title, where I look at not only the game itself, but also the packaging for the game, including the manual and possibly other various tokens that might have been included with it. Also, I try to go over the history of the game, where it came from, and perhaps if there's anything else interesting that I can find about said game. The end goal for the channel is to review each and every English language game for all four of those consoles, making this channel a one-stop shop for the era. And I know there are plenty of other great sites out there that are dedicated to Sega in a similar manner, and they have a lot of great content as well. But the way I look at it is, with me creating this archive, all the opinions are coming from one person, myself, which should give a bit of consistency to the affair. Sure, I argue with myself from time to time, who doesn't, but for the most part, if I complain or praise one specific thing in a certain game, I'm more than likely going to have that same viewpoint if a similar issue comes up in a different game, which may or may not happen when you have a bunch of different people with different viewpoints collaborating. Not that different viewpoints are wrong, mind you, but sometimes it's good to have that consistent baseline, which is what I'm trying to provide. Now, I know that last paragraph was probably super boring to most people, so this is probably a really bad time to ask, but if you're interested in seeing me continue this journey for another 1100 games or so, you may want to consider subscribing, as I try to have new videos up every Monday morning, but sometimes, maybe when work is really intense or someone's having a birthday party, well, the schedule might get off a bit. Plus, it helps other people see the channel, and if you like it, maybe they'll like it too. Okay, that's enough preamble. Let's get to this week's game, which is Hardball III from Accolade, which was released in the United States in 1993. If you're a longtime viewer of the channel, you might be a bit confused, as I reviewed the original Hardball for Genesis in episode 40 during the first year of the channel. Reviewing a sports sequel to a previous title that I've reviewed isn't that odd. I've done it a few times now on the channel. But ask yourself, Hardball 3, where's Hardball 2? Well, no, I haven't gotten sloppy this time. No, you see, in this case, the sloppiness, if you can call it that, is squarely on Accolade. Hardball, and Hardball 2 for that matter, were never released for home consoles and instead only appeared on various 8 and 16-bit computers. The Hardball reviewed in episode 40 is actually a wholly original game. You could consider it possibly an advanced version of Hardball 2 with better graphics and more features. This one-off Genesis title was followed then by Hardball 3 on home computers the next year in 1992, and at this point Accolade decided it made sense to now merge the two series, releasing a port of Hardball 3 directly on the Genesis in 1993, which is why the name Hardball 2 was skipped. To further confuse the situation, Accolade decided to port the same game again to the Super Nintendo in 1994, right before releasing Hardball 4 for the Genesis. Except on the Genesis, it wasn't Hardball 4, it was now Hardball 94, to better match up with the yearly numbering that had become the norm for console sports releases. Confused? Well, you should be, thanks Accolade. But let's go ahead and move on with a look at the package. And here's my copy of Hardball 3. This is back when Accolade was still in the process of suing Sega back and forth over the rights to produce unlicensed games for the Genesis, so as a result, Accolade was still using their original cardboard boxes to sell games. I actually think this might have been the last Accolade release to be in a cardboard box before they'd switched to clamshells, but I didn't bother to verify that, so if you know for certain, leave a comment down below to clarify that. This particular copy is in fantastic shape. With cardboard box releases, especially the early Electronic Arts and the later Sega Majesco boxes, you always have to be very careful to make sure that they don't get damaged, as the cardboard used is pretty thin, and if you're not paying attention, it's easy to tear a flap or possibly crush the box by putting something heavy on top of it. But with these Accolade boxes, they're constructed in such a way that they're a bit sturdier, and they actually are more similar to the older shoebox style that some home computer releases used, as you'll see when we open it up. That definitely has helped this copy stay together, as it's fully intact with no water or sun damage to the box, and only minimal scratching or smudging on the back. A few notes on the front cover. First off, I really like this artwork. The early Accolade Genesis titles, including the original Hardball, all had nicely painted Boris Vallejo cover art. So while they might have been technically unlicensed, they as a company at least knew how to properly promote a product. This isn't one of those Vallejo covers, but it looks great regardless. Then there's the line at the top about Al Michaels announces, which also appears on the sides, the rear cover, and the front of the manual. Now, I know this was a big feature that they wanted to promote, but this just seems slightly over the top, to the point where the game's article on Sega Retro actually refers to the name of the game as being Al Michaels Announces Hardball 3, rather than just Hardball 3. There had to be a better way to advertise that. Maybe Hardball 3 featuring Al Michaels, or a few other variations. Finally, there's this sticker here for winning a trip to Cooperstown, and if you don't know why that's significant, maybe you're not from the United States, Cooperstown is where the Baseball Hall of Fame is. Well, this was apparently a legit contest, but unfortunately I don't have the insert that refers to the details about it. To any younger viewers, yes, back in the day it wasn't uncommon to see the occasional game with a contest surrounding it, trying to get you to purchase the game. Flipping over the back quickly, and at first glance, I didn't really care for the layout back here, but the more I looked at it, the more I appreciated it. I like the subtle things, like the 4 decent quality screenshots laid out like the bases on a baseball diamond, and all the flavor text is solid and explains the game well. Opening up the box, and you can see what I meant about these boxes being different, the top lifting off the bottom as opposed to using flaps. The cartridge is in great shape, although I have to point out they goofed up on the label. If you look at the top, the label is too long and overshoots the indentation. You may not think this is a big deal, but in a game where you might have to change the battery, like I did, you have to be very careful about opening it up, or else you'll tear that label because of it. Then there's the manual, which is fantastic. This thing is huge, but it's huge because there's tons of detail, screenshots, and frankly, the game has a lot of options to explain. And I think they did a solid job on all fronts. There's even a nice little bio section at the front on Al Michaels that has some details that I didn't realize, and a full 4-page glossary at the end for those that might not be familiar with certain baseball terms and abbreviations. Okay, that's the solid package for Hardball 3. Let's pop this one in and see if the game is just as good. Upon booting up Hardball 3 for the first time, I was greeted by an interesting screen that noted, "First time initialization complete, press reset to continue." I don't think I've ever seen a message quite like that on a Genesis game, so I was a bit surprised, but I pressed reset as indicated and moved on into the game. What I ended up finding out, as you might have guessed this, is that this message is related to the fact that Hardball 3 supports battery backup for game saves, which is interesting because the Wikipedia page for the game specifically indicates, and I quote, "The console versions are simplified versions. Season stats are logged through a lengthy password in these versions due to the lack of a hard disk drive." Okay, well, Wikipedia is certainly not accurate all the time, so maybe this is just a miss. And then, a look at the line above, it states, "This game is licensed by the Major League Baseball Players Association." Well, it most certainly is not, and now I'm really confused. One thing being off, that's a mistake. 2 things being off, something's not right. I then look over at the screenshot that the article is using, and it's for the Super Nintendo version that I mentioned came out the year after, and I notice it has the MLBPA logo on the cover, so now things are starting to come together. I start to do some research, and it's at this point I realize a few things. First, there doesn't seem to be as good a resource for the Super Nintendo titles on the internet as Sega Retro, so this definitely makes me thankful that I'm doing Sega reviews and not Nintendo reviews. Although I will give a shout out to SNES Central, as they were somewhat helpful, and I'll probably use them in the future, but if anyone has any other recommendations for detailed SNES information, definitely let me know in the comments below. So, I go to pull out Pat Contreras' guide to the SNES library instead, and it definitely lists the SNES version as using password saves. Okay, now I'm invested. I'd assumed the Super Nintendo version was just a delayed port, but now it's clear that there's some major differences between these two. I ended up personally taking a deeper dive, and here's what I found out. First, the rosters for the Super Nintendo version are based on the 1993 MLB rosters, And the Genesis version, even though the game doesn't feature a specific MLBPA license, is based on the 1991 MLB rosters, like the PC version. This somewhat makes sense with the Super Nintendo version coming out in the summer of 1994. So you might think the Super Nintendo version is better. Well, not so fast. You see, apparently whoever wrote that Wikipedia article was specifically referring to that Super Nintendo version because they were correct about that version relying on passwords, whereas the Genesis version does utilize battery backups, which is very important for reasons I'll get to in a minute. Also, if you look at the cover for the Super Nintendo version, you'll notice nothing about Al Michaels. Well, that's because all the speech, other than basic sound effects, has been ripped out of that Super Nintendo version. Not sure if that was done for licensing reasons, technical reasons, or just a cost-saving measure to offset the MLBPA license, but it's a sizable change. Okay, so why is it so important that the Genesis version have battery backup? And even more important for the battery to actually be functional, but that's another story entirely. Well, for one, Hardball III supports playing through a few different lengths of seasons, up to a full 162 game schedule. Along with saving your progress as you go through the season, the game also saves a limited set of statistics for each player, so you can keep an eye on how your players are doing. And if you've ever played a baseball game, you know that it can take a while to play through a full 9 innings. So the battery backup option also allows you to save a game in progress and come back to it later. Something that the password save feature on the Super Nintendo doesn't support, with it only saving your progress after a game is completed. This is a fantastic feature, and I think it's one of the earlier baseball games to actually support this. Or at least, I can't think of a console baseball game that came out previously that does. Okay, so you can save your progress without having to rely on a password. That's good, but it's also somewhat pedestrian. What else can you do with battery backup? Well, as I mentioned, even though the game doesn't have a specific MLBPA license like the SNES version, it does have accurate rosters down to the stats for the players that competed in the 1991 season. The game also has a full featured player edit feature, so for teams that you own, you can own up to 2 teams in a season mode, with the idea being 1 for each player. You can go and rename all the players to their proper names and change their pictures to something more accurate for that player. You can even change the stats and attributes and positions for each of the players, so if you wanted to have a team of unbeatable Supermen, you could do that. Finally, you can edit and save higher level team and league options as well. You can rename the 2 leagues to the American and National League, rename the names of the All-Star and Playoff Series, and even rename the team names, colors, descriptions, and there's a pixel-based graphic editor included if you want to recreate an official logo or come up with something original. Frankly, I was blown away at all the customization options available, and you better believe I renamed all the players on the Cubs to the actual players that were on that 1991 roster. I'm sure that as I continue to go through the games on the Genesis, I'll get to other titles that have similar features, but for mid-1993, this is pretty mind-blowing stuff. But it also makes sense, seeing as how the game is a port of a PC game, which at the time had definitely leaned more towards the Sim style of things. And here's where things need to come back down to earth a bit, if you're not a simulation fan anyway. The gameplay in Hardball III, well, it's clear it didn't have as much work put into it as the core framework of the game did, and serves as more of a means to an end. This doesn't necessarily mean that the game plays poorly, but I would say it's firmly in the mediocre territory, and like anything else, it probably grows on you the more you get used to it. However, if you are a fan of the original Hardball for the Genesis, the gameplay is definitely going to be considered a bit of a step back, unfortunately. Batting has improved slightly with the addition of a more traditional behind-the-ump camera that can be used if you don't want to rely on the classic picture view that was used in previous games. But what has been downgraded significantly is the field play. When a ball is put into play, a camera angle is used that's far overhead, showing the full length of the field. This harkens back to how the original computer Hardball worked, going back to the Commodore 64 version. This works okay for infield hits, but anything that goes to the outfield is problematic, and it's difficult to tell where your fielders need to go due to the compressed aspect of that part of the field. I believe this was done as a stylistic choice, as one of the selling points of the game is that it features representations of all 26 MLB stadiums at the time, and this was their way of showing off. Oh yeah, that's Wrigley, or oh yeah, that's the Green Monster. But this, combined with the fact that the computer can be difficult to pitch to begin with, causes some headaches. Luckily, the game does come with a full-featured set of game options to partially help rectify this. Rather than specifically use a difficulty level, like was used in the previous Genesis Hardball, there are 11 different switches that can be flipped to tweak your experience. If you really want to focus on a simulation experience, you can turn on Manage Only mode that limits you to just making substitutions and lineup changes, and leaving all the actual gameplay to the computer. If you want to take more of a hands-on approach to the gameplay, there's options to give the game more of an arcade-style feel by making the pitchers never tire, or making all pitchers and batters equal. But the options that stand out to me are the ones that enable auto-fielding, but still requiring you to make throws to bases, and forcing the computer to throw strikes, which evens the offensive playfield substantially. From a graphical perspective, Hardball 3 is a bit of a mixed bag. I like the general presentation of the game, and there seems to be a decent amount of animation to the sprites. There's also the occasional cutscene that's shown when a close play is made. And I do like how the individual stadiums are represented. Even though there's no actual MLB license in the game, it does make it feel that much more like you're watching a game on TV. Having said all that, it's very clear that the graphics in-game weren't a priority when compared to the sim engine. And in fact, I would say the graphics perhaps were even behind the sound engine in priority, something you definitely didn't see every day in the 8 and 16-bit era. Speaking of that sound engine, I am incredibly impressed with what Accolade was able to come up with. Hardball 3 isn't the first baseball game on the Genesis to have a play-by-play announcer, with Sega's own Sports Talk Baseball coming out the year before. However, Sports Talk Baseball just has a generic announcer that was apparently synthesized from the voices of the company that worked on the engine for Sega, Western Technologies. Hardball 3 takes the idea of having an announcer and bumps it up another notch by including the voice of legendary announcer Al Michaels. And it actually sounds like him. Sure, it's stilted in places and it's certainly not perfect, but having an actual well-known play-by-play announcer in a game released in 1993? It was absolutely unheard of, especially for a cartridge-based game and not a CD-ROM. In fact, here, let me shut up for about 30 seconds so you can hear what the game sounds like.
At the plate, number 51, the pitcher, a 138 hitter. Fastball swung and missed for strike 2. Line to the shortstop, caught by the shortstop. That's 1 away. Up at bat, number 12, the shortstop, batting .260. He's 0 for 1.
Clearly the speech is the focus of the sound engine, but the music and sound effects are decent as well. And if you get tired of any of the above, the game also does have the option of turning any or all of them off. I'm not going to mince words. Hardball 3 blew me away when I first played it. It's not perfect, certainly, and the gameplay definitely took a dip from the previous title. But the level of detail included, especially from a customization perspective, is one of the most impressive things I've experienced in the 3 years that I've done this channel. I really wish I could give this game 4 stars, which is something I never expected to say when I scheduled the game in this slot on the review schedule, but the gameplay just isn't to the level that I would expect from a 4-star game. So instead, I'm giving Hardball 3 3 stars. Baseball fans and stat nerds should definitely give this one a look, and skip the Super Nintendo version. Okay, that was Hardball 3. One of the things I love the most about doing this channel is when I play a game and it's not just better than I was expecting, but it's so much better than I was expecting that I want everyone to know about it. It's not perfect, to be sure, but I think it's definitely a game that you could tweak the options and get a lot of enjoyment out of, as long as you're willing to overlook certain gameplay issues. Next week on Zilog and Moto, it's a sequel, but not a sports game sequel. And actually, the fact that it's a sequel is somewhat debatable. It's got a number at the end of its name, to be sure, but I've definitely got some questions as to why that is. We'll take a look at that and try to tease out why Tengen decided to name it the way they did and give the game a thorough look. I'm actually kind of excited. I didn't realize I had it on the schedule. It was definitely a nice surprise to look down and be like, oh, I'm playing that next week? Cool. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video. And remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.